He was 28 years old when the world first called him a genius, and for a brief, blinding moment, it seemed like they were right. In just a few years he had gone from an anonymous programmer with a cluttered apartment and second-hand laptop to the founder of a $26 billion empire that promised to revolutionize finance for the ordinary person. Cameras loved him, investors worshipped him, and politicians lined up to shake his hand, eager to be photographed next to the boy who, they said, had hacked the future. He told a simple story that people wanted to believe. He claimed he was building a platform where anyone, teacher, truck driver, single mother, could finally escape the broken banking system and make their money work for them. His messy hair, cheap t-shirts, and awkward speeches were part of the magic. He didn't look like the old, corrupt billionaires everyone hated. He looked like the awkward kid who always sat at the back of the classroom, the one who somehow figured out how to beat a game the rest of the world didn't even understand. The numbers were hypnotic. Charts shooting straight up, user counts doubling and tripling, billions in deposits flowing in from every corner of the globe, all displayed on sleek dashboards and glossy investor decks. Journalists called him the new face of ethical capitalism, a genius who claimed he didn't care about yachts or private jets because all he wanted was to help people build a better future. While his users stared at screens in cramped apartments and cheap offices, watching their balances tick upwards by a few dollars at a time, his own fortune exploded into tens of billions on paper, and then, almost overnight, into reality. But the reality his customers lived was very different from his. Behind the optimistic tweets and glossy conference stages, many of the people who trusted him were desperate. Families crushed by inflation, workers juggling 2 or 3 jobs, parents wondering how they would pay rent and still put food on the table. They weren't chasing luxury, they were chasing survival. When they deposited money into his platform, they weren't speculating, they were begging the numbers to rise just enough to pay next month's bills, to keep the lights on, to buy their children a pair of shoes that actually fit. As their deposits climbed higher, so did his standard of living, and the distance between his words and his life became a canyon. In a private compound on a sun-soaked island, he lived in a glass and marble palace where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked down on turquoise water and white yachts. Inside, there were infinity pools, game rooms, private chefs, and parties that lasted until sunrise, where the boy genius walked barefoot on imported stone floors, phone in hand, casually moving millions of dollars with a flick of his thumb while assistants hovered nearby with fresh drinks and glowing screens. He loved to give interviews from that compound, slouched in a gaming chair with a messy background staged to look humble, carefully angling the camera so viewers couldn't see the luxury just out of frame. He would talk about financial inclusion and democratizing opportunity, while wearing a stretched-out t-shirt, as if the cheap clothes proved he was just like his users. Yet outside the camera's narrow field of view, there were garages full of exotic cars, private jets on standby, and entire floors dedicated to his inner circle, young loyal executives who laughed at his jokes, followed his orders, and never asked too many questions about where all the money actually came from. From the beginning, there was a secret at the core of his empire, a line of code and a set of internal rules that no customer, no regulator, and no outsider was ever supposed to see. The platform that advertised itself as the safest place for your money quietly funneled billions of customer funds into a separate, hidden entity under his personal control. On paper, this entity was just a research firm, a harmless trading operation designed to provide liquidity and stabilize the market. In reality, it was his private casino where he placed enormous, reckless bets using chips that didn't belong to him. When those bets went well, he bragged on stage about his vision and risk management, pounding out long threads on social media about how traditional finance was stuck in the past while he built the future. When they went badly, he simply reached deeper into the pile of customer deposits, telling himself that it was temporary, that as long as the market bounced back, nobody would ever know. The numbers on user dashboards still looked fine after all, and as long as they were green, what harm could there be in borrowing just a little more, just a little longer? For a while, the world rewarded his deception. Influencers made videos praising his platform as the only place I trust with my money. Celebrities lined up to become ambassadors, smiling next to his logo in glossy ads and Super Bowl commercials. Politicians accepted his donations and nodded along as he testified in hearings, painting himself as a responsible innovator begging for reasonable regulation, while his lawyers and lobbyists rewrote the rules to keep his empire untouched. Every hand he shook bought him more time. Every award he accepted wrapped his lies in another layer of respectability. But under the surface, pressure was building. The global economy started to shake, markets turned, and suddenly the easy gains that had covered his losses stopped appearing. The risky bets made in secret rooms and hidden trading accounts were no longer paper losses that could be waved away with a confident tweet. They were real, swelling holes in his balance sheet, and the only way to fill them was to steal even more from the very people he claimed to be helping. Every night, he watched the numbers on his private dashboards turn from green to red, and every night, he told himself the same thing: just one more good week. Just one big win. Then I'll put it all back. 6 months before his arrest, the cracks reached the surface. A quiet report from a little-known analyst raised a simple, devastating question. If the company was as healthy as he claimed, why did its internal numbers look so strange, so fragile, so obviously manipulated? A few skeptical voices started whispering online. A journalist requested documents and didn't like what they saw. A competitor, sensing blood in the water, began unloading his company's tokens in public, triggering sharp drops, panicked threads, and the first real wave of doubt among his once loyal fans. What happened next unfolded at the speed of the internet. In hours, not days, rumors became headlines and headlines became fear. Customers who had never read a financial report in their lives didn't need accounting jargon to understand what was happening. All they had to see were screenshots of withdrawals failing, withdrawal times delayed due to high volume, and support messages that sounded more like stall tactics than solutions. In living rooms, offices, cafes, and cramped bedrooms around the world, people opened the app they had trusted with their future and saw the spinning wheel of death where a simple withdrawal successful once appeared. A digital bank run had begun, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For years he had boasted about deep liquidity and unbreakable systems, but those were illusions that depended on one thing: people believing they could always get their money out. Once that belief cracked, once the first group rushed for the exit and found the doors stuck, the panic became contagious. In chat groups and on social media, messages flew: withdraw now. Get out while you can. Something's wrong. The more people tried to leave, the more obvious it became that the money was no longer there. Inside his island compound, the scenes were almost surreal. Screens everywhere, alarms firing off, executives pacing barefoot across marble floors while they whispered about options and contingencies that no longer existed. Lawyers were pulled into emergency calls. Spreadsheets were rewritten in real time to make the disaster look smaller than it was. Someone suggested finding a last-minute buyer, a bigger company to swallow the mess and keep the brand alive. He latched onto that idea like a drowning man grabbing a piece of driftwood, making desperate calls to rivals he had once mocked, begging them to save him. For a few hours, the world believed he might actually pull it off. A single tweet from a competitor hinting at a possible bailout sent hope surging through the markets. His supporters rallied, accusing critics of spreading fear and lies. Loyal users posted screenshots declaring they were here for the long run, insisting that the genius who built a $26 billion empire couldn't possibly be hiding a fraud large enough to sink it. But hope doesn't repair a black hole in a balance sheet, and when the potential savior finally saw the real numbers, the deal was dead before the ink could dry. The announcement came quickly and brutally: no rescue, no bailout, no white knight. Within hours, withdrawals were frozen, the platform was temporarily paused, and customers were told to remain calm while the company evaluated its options. For many of them, this was the moment the bottom fell out of their lives. On their screens, balances still appeared as numbers, but they no longer meant anything. They were ghost figures, digital illusions that could not be turned back into groceries, rent, medicine, or tuition. In the days that followed, the human cost began to surface, one heartbreaking story at a time. A single mother who had transferred her emergency savings to his platform because the local bank's interest rates were too low, now staring at a frozen account while her landlord threatened eviction. A retired couple who entrusted their nest egg to the brilliant kid everyone trusted, now waking up at 3 a.m, calculating how many months they could survive before the money ran out. A young man in a small town who had believed the ads promising a way out of poverty, now wondering how to tell his parents that the money they had pooled together for a family business had vanished into a server he would never see. While his customers panicked, he retreated into a world of lawyers, crisis PR teams, and carefully scripted statements. He released long, rambling messages claiming he was shocked and sorry, implying that this was all a big misunderstanding, an unfortunate liquidity issue rather than outright theft. He framed himself as overwhelmed, a visionary who had grown too fast, a victim of market conditions, rather than a man who had quietly rerouted billions of other people's dollars into his own risky bets. Behind closed doors, however, investigators were already peeling back the layers of his empire, and what they found was far more than incompetence. The records told a story his public statements never would. Internal chats where executives joked about plugging holes with customer funds. Secret spreadsheets tracking the hidden transfers between customer accounts and his private trading firm. Code commits that gave his own accounts special privileges, allowing them to run negative balances that no normal user could access. It wasn't a simple mistake, it was a machine built to siphon money from the many to the few, hidden behind a smiling face and a stream of buzzwords about innovation and access. When the arrest finally came, it felt symbolic. The boy genius in handcuffs, let out from the same luxury compound he had used as a broadcast studio for his promises of a better financial world. The cameras that once glorified him now captured every grim detail. The bowed head, the rumpled clothes, the stunned expression of a man who had always believed he was too important, too connected, too adored to ever face real consequences. Flashbulbs popped as he was placed into the back of a car, the island's bright sun glaring off the window like a spotlight on the end of a performance. In court, the myth finished dying. No amount of messy hair or awkward charm could save him from the documents, the messages, the testimony of his own inner circle now speaking under oath to save themselves. Former allies described secret meetings where he ordered them to fix the numbers, to not spook the markets, to buy more time with money that was never his to spend. Experts walked the jury through the convoluted paths customer funds had taken, tracing lines from small deposits in struggling neighborhoods to luxury condos, private jets, and speculative trades so large they distorted entire markets. The verdict was swift, the sentence devastating. In the same headlines that had once called him the youngest self-made billionaire, new words appeared: fraud, betrayal, prison. From $26 billion on paper to a concrete cell with a narrow bed and a steel toilet, in less than 6 months. The boy who had been praised as the savior of a broken system was now its most notorious cautionary tale, a living reminder that charisma is not honesty, that an app is not a guarantee, and that the people who talk the loudest about changing the world are often just changing their own bank accounts. But the story doesn't end with a guilty verdict. In many ways, it was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The sentencing hearing was packed with rage. Victims sat in the gallery, some of them visibly shaking, clutching printed statements they had written for the judge. A woman in her 60s stood and described how she had transferred her life savings, $473,000, to FTX because she believed she was investing in the future. She had spent 43 years working as a nurse, spending 12-hour shifts on her feet in hospitals, watching her body age while she saved every penny she could. In a few months, those decades of labor disappeared. An elderly man with tears streaming down his face talked about his wife, who had suffered a stroke after learning that their retirement funds were gone. A young couple in their late 20s who had been told they were too early in their career to invest in traditional markets, had given FTX $30,000 that they had borrowed from family members. Now they faced years of debt repayment to relatives who would likely never forgive them. The judge listened to all of it without expression, then handed down his sentence: 25 years in federal prison. A quarter of a century locked away. By the time Bankman-Fried would be eligible for release, the teenagers of today would be middle-aged adults. The children of some of his victims would have grown up never knowing their parents' full potential, never receiving the education or opportunities they might have had, never getting to do the things the stolen money might have made possible. The sentence was symbolic of something larger than any individual punishment. It was a statement that in a society where the rules are supposed to apply equally, the fall from grace is as dramatic as the rise had been meteoric. In the prison transport vehicle on the way to federal custody, Bankman-Fried had time to think, perhaps for the first time in years, about the actual people behind the numbers. Not the numbers on his screens, not the billions moving between accounts, but the actual human beings whose lives depended on those digits. He had always thought of them abstractly, as data points, as accounts to be managed, as deposits to be leveraged. Now, sitting in handcuffs, he was learning what they actually were. A teacher in Montana who had wanted to retire early and spend time with her grandchildren. A construction worker in Texas who had given FTX his entire disability settlement. A nurse in California who had gambled on crypto because traditional savings accounts weren't growing fast enough. A musician in Brazil who had scraped together everything he had, convinced that blockchain technology was the future and that this platform was his chance to finally break even. These people had not harmed anyone. They had not committed fraud. They had not stolen or lied or betrayed. They had simply trusted the wrong person, and for that mistake many of them would spend decades trying to recover financially. Some never would. Some would die before they had a chance to fully rebuild what was taken from them. The judge's sentence was appropriate, but it could never truly balance the equation. There was no prison term long enough, no restitution complete enough to undo the damage that had been done. The investigation continued long after the conviction, and it revealed a stunning level of coordination among Bankman-Fried's inner circle. Gary Wang, his co-founder, had not just passively allowed the fraud to happen. He had actively engineered its infrastructure. He had written the code that created this special exception, allowing Alameda to run massive negative balances. He had designed the systems that hid these transactions from auditors and regulators. During his testimony, he explained that he had believed at the time that what he was doing was acceptable because Bankman-Fried was his close friend and mentor, and he had trusted that there was some legitimate business purpose to it all. But the truth was more sinister. Wang had known that the balances were impossible, that the numbers didn't add up, that the only way Alameda could owe the amounts it owed was if it had been given access to customer deposits. Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, had a slightly different role in the conspiracy. She was the face of the trading firm, the person who presented false balance sheets to lenders, the person who signed documents claiming that Alameda had far more assets than it actually did. In her testimony, she described a culture of deception where falsifying records was routine, where lying to lenders was treated as a simple business necessity, where the phrase, "that's not necessarily true," was used constantly when she was asked about specific financial claims. She testified that Bankman-Fried had explicitly instructed her to borrow as much money as we can at whatever terms we can, and when she expressed concern about some of their behavior, his response was to tell her to simply fix the numbers and not worry about the details. Nishad Singh, the chief technology officer, had played a crucial role in moving money around and creating shell entities, in laying digital breadcrumbs that eventually led investigators back to the center of the conspiracy. His role was perhaps the most damning in some ways, because he was the one who had truly understood the technical architecture of the fraud. He understood every layer, every barrier, every failsafe that had been deliberately disabled. When the investigation began, Singh had actually provided information to prosecutors relatively quickly, leading them to the hidden databases, the secret accounts, the special exception, that was the heart of the entire operation. What shocked many observers was how casual the entire conspiracy seemed to have been. In text messages and emails that were later revealed as evidence, the conspirators joked about plugging holes, about buying time, about the customer funds as if they were a pool that could simply be dipped into whenever necessary. There were messages where they laughed about the irony of Bankman-Fried's public statements about security and safety while they were actively stealing from customers. There were references to value-extractive spending, to loans to executives that could never be repaid, to investments in side projects that had nothing to do with the core business and everything to do with personal enrichment. The spending was obscene. Bankman-Fried had used customer deposits to purchase a $16 million penthouse in the Bahamas, not just for himself but as a compound for his inner circle. The building became legendary in certain circles for its parties, its lavishness, its complete disconnect from the real world where millions of people were watching their life savings disappear. There were luxury vehicles, private jet charters, donations to political candidates, investments in sports teams, purchases of digital art for hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of it paid for with money that had been deposited by people who thought they were securing their financial futures. But perhaps most egregious was how Bankman-Fried had used customer deposits to fund his political donations. He had become the second largest Democratic donor in the United States, funneling millions of dollars into campaigns, super PACs, and political causes. The money was completely clean on the surface. No regulator would have been able to look at the Federal Election Commission filings and determine that every penny came from customer deposits that were supposed to be kept safe in segregated accounts. Politicians had attended his parties, accepted his donations, and basked in the glow of being associated with the boy genius of crypto. They had praised his vision, championed his cause, and done exactly nothing to ensure that his company was actually trustworthy. This was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire scandal. The willingness of powerful people to turn a blind eye to obvious red flags because they benefited from the arrangement. Venture capital firms had made enormous investments in FTX without conducting the kind of due diligence that should be standard for any major financial entity. Regulators had issued guidance about cryptocurrency exchanges but had failed to enforce it with any real teeth. Auditors had declined to audit FTX or had been specifically excluded from accessing the areas where the fraud was happening. The media had fawned over Bankman-Fried without asking tough questions about the sustainability of his business model or the basic math that made no sense. The effective altruism community, which Bankman-Fried had claimed to represent, had also been complicit in a different way. They had accepted donations from him without performing adequate due diligence on where the money came from. Some organizations had built relationships with him, had allowed their reputation to become intertwined with his, had promoted his ideas because he was funding their work. When the fraud was revealed, organizations like the Center for Effective Altruism faced serious questions about their role in enabling one of the largest frauds in modern history. Had they been too trusting? Had they ignored red flags? Had the promise of significant funding clouded their judgment? The bankruptcy proceedings revealed layer after layer of complexity. Billions of dollars in customer funds were gone, distributed across luxury real estate, venture capital investments, failed cryptocurrency projects, and personal loans to executives. Bankruptcy trustees worked for years trying to recover assets, filing lawsuits against major companies that had received investments, against real estate firms that had sold property at inflated prices to Alameda, against hedge funds and venture capital firms that had done business with the fraudsters. Every dollar recovered was returned to the victims, but it was never enough. The hole was too deep, the spending too widespread, the trail too convoluted to ever fully reconstruct. For the victims, the aftermath was long and painful. Those who had lost money began support groups, met online in forums dedicated to sharing their stories, tried to help each other navigate the emotional and financial trauma of having been victimized by fraud on such a massive scale. Some of them had become activists, pushing for stricter regulation of the cryptocurrency industry, demanding that government agencies establish better safeguards, calling for increased oversight of cryptocurrency exchanges. Others simply tried to move forward, to rebuild what they could, to put the experience behind them and avoid thinking about it too much because thinking about it only brought back the feeling of betrayal and helplessness. The legacy of FTX extended far beyond the immediate financial losses. The scandal dealt a devastating blow to the entire cryptocurrency industry, which had been built on promises of being better than traditional finance, of being trustless and transparent. Instead, it turned out that crypto exchanges could be just as corrupt, just as opaque, and just as willing to commit fraud as any traditional bank. The public trust that had been building around cryptocurrency, especially among younger investors and those who had been historically excluded from traditional financial systems, was shattered. Regulatory pushback intensified dramatically. Governments around the world began implementing stricter rules, larger capital requirements, mandatory audits, and real oversight of cryptocurrency exchanges. Bankman-Fried's conviction was significant not just for what it meant for him personally, but for what it signaled about accountability in an industry that had previously seemed above reproach. It showed that even the most celebrated, most connected, most seemingly untouchable figures could be prosecuted and convicted when the evidence was overwhelming. It showed that charisma and connections could only protect you so far, that eventually, if the fraud was big enough, the consequences would catch up with you. But the story also raised uncomfortable questions about systemic failures that went beyond any individual perpetrator. Why had basic oversight been so inadequate? Why had venture capitalists invested billions without proper due diligence? Why had politicians accepted donations from someone running such an obvious fraud? Why had the media been so eager to celebrate a narrative without questioning it? These were questions that implicated not just Bankman-Fried, but the entire ecosystem that had allowed him to flourish for as long as he had. In his cell, Bankman-Fried would eventually be offered a chance to appeal his conviction. His lawyers filed motions, argued that certain evidence should have been excluded, that his trial had been unfair, that he deserved another chance to present his case. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The messages, the code, the spreadsheets, the testimony of his own co-conspirators, it was almost impossible to see how any appeals court could overturn his conviction. The truth was simply too well documented, too thoroughly proven beyond reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, in living rooms and cramped apartments and small offices around the world, the people he had stolen from continued their lives, carrying the invisible weight of his fraud. A teacher who had to work 5 more years past when she had planned to retire. A young man who had to postpone his dreams of starting a business. A family that had to make difficult choices about their children's education. An elderly couple that had to give up travel and leisure because their nest egg was gone. These were the real costs of his conviction, not measured in years of prison time but in years of delayed dreams and shattered futures. The case of Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX stands as a reminder that in a world where finance increasingly operates digitally and where trust has been replaced by code and algorithms, the human element remains crucial. The platforms and exchanges and financial systems we use are only as honest as the people running them, and when those people are willing to commit fraud, no amount of technical sophistication can prevent the disaster that follows. The boy genius from Silicon Valley had learned a hard lesson in federal prison. That being smart is not the same as being good, that success built on lies is fragile, and that eventually, even the most elaborate fraud will collapse under the weight of its own deception. What remains in the aftermath is the question of whether the systems that allowed him to succeed for so long have truly been reformed, or whether the next fraud is already in development, waiting for the moment when oversight relaxes and the next generation of visionaries begins to spin their own elaborate lies.